Thank you for joining us for the latest Centre for World Studies webinar. We've had a great turnout over the past few months for these, and we're delighted to have another great event with a great lineup of speakers. This one is on the subtopic of, is big tech a threat to free speech and conservative voices? Along with this, does it fit into the culture wars we're currently seeing? We're delighted to be joined by two speakers, albeit Mark Reckless will be joining us in the next 10 or 15, 20 minutes. We're delighted to be joined by, firstly, Dr. Philip Kiszely. He's an author and lecturer in performance and cultural history at Leeds University. And Mark Reckless, as I just mentioned, he's a former MP and now the member of the Senate for South Wales East. So obviously, I'll kick it off with you, Dr. Kiszely. Firstly, is big tech a threat to free speech, and how? And if so, how so is it? How is this threat real, or is it just something that's been brought up in the imaginations of people?
No, I don't think it's in anybody's imagination. I think it's a very real threat, and I think it's a real threat for us on what I would call the conservative side of the line. It's not a threat for the leftists and radical leftists, because they're not interested in free speech anyway. And I was just thinking about it today, this afternoon, just kind of jotting a few things down and thinking about, well, what really are we talking about here? And it seems to me that we've kind of we've maneuvered ourselves into a corner as far as big tech are concerned. You know, there's a handful of companies who absolutely dominate our lives. In terms of work, in terms of play, how we do politics, how we do culture. They define how we speak, they define when we speak, they dictate what we say. I think what's really interesting about it is the demographic. These are the people, of course, who tell us that we're not diverse enough. You know, we need to be diverse. My God, we're not diverse, you know. And what's interesting about the demographic of companies like Facebook, I was just messing around today, and I thought, what's the average age of the employee at Facebook and Twitter, Google, and the big five generally? Okay, if we're talking about big tech, we're talking about the big five. It's 27. 27 years old, between 27 and 29. I think the average age for Facebook is 28, right? So it's 27 and 29. So it's, and I don't want to sound like an old fart here, although I probably am one, but it's kids, dictating the terms on which we speak, on which we work, all the things I've said before. They call the shots, and the interesting thing about them is that they all look the same. They all think the same. They've all got the same ethos. They've all got the same set of ideas, and they're all from the identitarian left. Okay, I think that's one thing that's kind of really, really important. And so, how's this happened? What before we think about, well, what can we do about it? I think we've got to know where it comes from, and I think it's people like me, not me personally, because I'm not a radical leftist, but I think it's the education establishment primarily who taught a generation of young people in a radical leftist identitarian way, taught them to be censorious, taught them that freedom of speech actually is equated with hate speech, and has taught them that all of these people who are now part of big tech, they equate censorship and they equate kind of shutting down of free speech with virtue. And they're demonstrating virtue if they're shutting down all of these hateful conservatives. And this actually comes from, if we're talking about big tech and what can we do about this, if we can answer the question, which is the question that's the headline tonight, where does it come from? I have to say it comes from the classroom. I have to say it comes from colleges. I have to say it comes from universities. because they've, first of all, they don't teach history. None of these people know about, I sound like Jordan Peterson here, don't I? But none of these people know about, the Gulag and all of the kind of totalitarian leftist kind of nightmare that is the 20th century. They know a little bit about the Nazis, but they don't know too much about that either. Okay, so they have this kind of identitarian, intersectional set of ideas, and big tech and social media in particular is a reflection of that. So I think what we really need to do is tackle the problem at source, which is, I'm speaking as a teacher here, aren't I, as an academic, but how we educate our young people, I think. And then if we do that and we tackle this, what Roger Scruton calls this culture of repudiation, okay, and this self-loathing and this hatred of the West, then maybe we can say, then it's probably the time to say, okay, well, let's tackle big tech. Let's have kind of different platforms, and let's make a proper space for conservatism.
Yeah, because the question we've had is, how can we combat the shutting down of voices without isolating ourselves from all social media? And it's a good question, because, like you say, if it starts in the classroom with it's a long-term project to try and build up a zone, not a zone for speech, a free speech flowing again. And the battle of ideas. So how do we combat this without making ourselves social media pariahs, outcasts, so to speak?
It's not something we can do. We can't pour two chemicals together and then create a perfect space for ourselves. There are spaces, aren't there? There are spaces like Parler and different kinds of social media kind of platforms that I've not been on them, so I don't know. I probably can't. I probably can't comment too accurately about that. Maybe there will be, if we have a Q&A later on, maybe other people can talk about that. But we need to do it kind of slowly, and we need to do it properly. There is a website that I've been on recently. I did a Q&A for, actually, called Retalk, which is it's actually based in Hungary. But it's for the centre and centre right, and it's anti-extremist, and it's political, and it's for conservatives to kind of explore and think about different things. So there are spaces that I think, as an academic, as a writer, as a teacher, are reasonable spaces and good spaces, but they're not just going to happen overnight. And it's the platforms. I think Google. We need an alternative to Google. And 15 years ago, there were loads of alternatives to Google, weren't there? There was Hotbot, there was Ask Jeeves, and all of that kind of stuff. But now there's just this kind of monopoly, and that needs to be broken down. And I suppose that's where we really start.
Because we've had, like I say, we had a lot of questions sent in before this, and another question is how do we break up monopoly? Is the way forward more platforms and breaking up monopoly? Is that the route forward to try and counter this sway that censoring we're seeing? Is the way to break them up by new platforms, or is there is it a more long-term idea of education to teach them about history, so they don't fall for the simple traps that they currently fall into?
Yeah, the answer is it's both of those things. I think the platforms thing is hugely important, because I mean, let's not forget, right? If we talk about social media from, say, 10 years ago, and if we think about the platforms then, they were useful to us on the conservative kind of centre and centre right. I mean, if you think about UKIP and the rise of UKIP up until 2014, absolutely, it revolved around YouTube, it revolved around social media. And if you think about the early campaigning around Brexit, for example, that's another one. But that was when, and people might correct me on this actually, but that was when platforms were platforms. But now there's a very definite and very sinister, I think, editorial hand at work here, and it's not even. It's not even subtle, it's not, it's shutting down the president of the United States. It's doing all of those things. So it's just to come back to the question, it's both of those things. It's developing new platforms. It's investment from the conservative right. There should be lots of money out there. Let's put it where it matters on the one hand. But it is, I do come back to this idea of education, this idea of rescuing the institutions, the civil service as well, the armed forces, for God's sake, rescuing those institutions from the radical leftists, I think is something that we need to do. So, I can't just say, there's an easy fix, and no one would expect me to say that, I know, but it's doing those, it's both of those things. It's the long term and the short term.
Brilliant. And I'll go on some questions. Like I said, Mark will join us in the next 20 minutes and asking these. But we'll go on to questions. Like I said, we've got a deluge of questions to get. And the first one is, you just sort of touched on it, and it's sort of, I think someone looking at some hope here from Morgan. Is there any hope for those on the right with a sitting US president being banned from Twitter and Facebook in January?
Yeah, there's always hope for us on the right. I think what we've got to do is just organize ourselves. I mean, the irony is that we're generally in the driving seat as far as politics is concerned, okay, and the economy, but we have been, I think, since the 60s, we're always playing catch up with culture. But we know, I mean, look at the 2019 general election, December 2019. That really wasn't about the economy. That was about identity. That was about culture. And Boris Johnson had a landslide because people balked, at identity politics, and balked about the appalling anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party and the hard left and all of that kind of thing. So it's how we unlock that kind of that culture, how we get to a stage where we can actually say, look, we've got something really kind of attractive to offer here culturally from the right, and it's an absolute kind of answer to the nonsense on the left, and I don't think we're a million miles away from that. And I come back to this idea again of in a way, social media has helped us, hasn't it? I mean, look at Jordan Peterson, for example. Enormous. He's got 19, 20 million views for loads of things he does. The late Sir Roger Scruton was using social media really well towards the end of his life. Douglas, Murray, doing all of those things as well. If we had our own platforms that were decent platforms, then it could really take off, I think.
Definitely. Like you say, I think we see a lot of investment in the old school traditional medias from the right. I think, like you say, that we have got the money there on our side. We have got the support and ideas. I think it's given it an output where people feel safe to also join the platform, because, like you said, with Gab and Parler, as soon as anyone that joined was written off as a white supremacist racist joining a far right platform. So I think, like you say, it's like trying to get someone from the mainstream money, trying to invest into a mainstream platform that can give these people the outlet, isn't it?
Yeah, I think conversations are going on. I mean, I know people who run really high profiles on high profile channels on YouTube, for example, and they're talking about, well, what can we do here? And they're getting their heads together and thinking about that. So yeah, I think things are happening.
Definitely. And we've got another one here. I've got another great question. Which is really interesting. Does all the anti-free speech and censorship feed into the anti-Western culture theme we've seen over the past year or so with, they've mentioned, etc. statues? Which would you agree? So would you agree? I would personally say it's been more than a year now, but although I think with lockdown it's sort of exposed it more, with nothing much else to focus on besides the pandemic. Would you agree, or would you say been there a lot longer, or would you agree?
Sorry, I just missed that the key word there.
Does all the censorship, does all the recent censorship we've seen over the past year and anti-Western culture theme feed into
anti-Western, right? Yeah. Oh yeah. I think it's blown up massively, hasn't it? And organizations like Black Lives Matter have kind of seized on it and really pushed it. And you know, you've got lots of young people. I don't know, because I teach young people locked in and feeling incredibly frustrated and wanting something to kind of kick out at. But I think it still comes down to this culture of repudiation that is so deeply entrenched. It's not just about virtue, the idea that, oh God, you know, I hate the West. It's not just about virtue. It's about kind of sophistication as well, or pseudo sophistication. So it feeds into that teenage mindset, which is essentially the radical left, and the activist mindset as well. The idea that, you know, I think in the 70s and 80s, while there was lots and lots of activism, it wasn't married to the idea of the kind of performative protests that we have now. In a way that it is now, and the idea that they didn't have Glastonbury last year, did they? So rather than going to go and celebrate with their mates at a festival, they go and run riot in the street. And I think there's something to that. Sometimes I think it's very easy to overthink a lot of this kind of stuff. You know, there's no Glastonbury, there's no festival. All right, well, we'll make a festival of our own and we'll run riot because we're really frustrated. I think there's a lot in that, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Where would you say we've usually seen in the UK? Well, I personally feel that we usually get a drag back from what we see in the American culture. So America has it, we get it a year later. So do you think, speaking on following this question that we just had about anti-Western, do you think that what we see in America over the past year with Antifa and that anti-Western value, do you think that's something we'll see more of? Because we got to taste a glimpse of taste today with the police in Bristol just recently, a couple of days. Is this what's coming next to the UK, do you think?
Yes, is the short answer. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I was kind of, I looked like with horror really at what was happening in Bristol. But one of the interesting things, and one of the really kind of positive things about it, was I saw it actually via Turning Point UK, which is the conservative student activist lobby pushing back. So we'll always have that kind of, you know, we've had it from the counterculture, we've had it through anarcho-punk, we've had it through rave culture, and now we've got it framed in BLM and Extinction Rebellion and all of that kind of thing. We're always going to have that element of youth culture, which will just react against anything, I think, on the one hand. But really positively, we're getting a stronger conservative body of young people who are just fed up with it. And I think if we get more of the Antifa stuff, and I think you're absolutely right, Ed, I think we'll definitely get that. We'll get a much kind of harder pushback, not just from people like you and me, and not just from kind of older kind of establishment figures, I suppose, but from young people as well. And that's the really important thing. I'm seeing so many more young people who are just really fed up with the kind of alternative truth that is identity politics, and really pushing back.
So obviously you actually spend a lot more time around teenage younger minds that the ones we usually see at these protests. So you obviously see a lot of these younger minds more than most people on the panel and attendees. So do you see a certain pushback? Do you think it's hit saturation that now people say that's it for me, that's the line, it's gone too far, I'm actually now where perhaps they wouldn't be as political or really go to the right or left? I think they've been forced to take a point now and to take a stance, and do you think that's been hardening now with people being anti-left, so to speak, not just people like me and you?
It's really interesting and it's really complicated, right? There is a conservative pushback, which is ideological, and which kind of is young people like, you know, Turning Point UK, who are kind of quite you know, patriotic and love their country and are socially conservative in a kind of Burkean kind of way. I think that's one constituency of people, I would say. Okay, and that's a really important constituency of people. There's another constituency of people who are actually very progressive, but I mean progressive. I don't mean that conservatives aren't progressive. I think they are, but the progressive in a kind of leftist way.
Yeah.
But are appalled, and I think this is especially young women, by the latent misogyny in some of the activist mindset and the activists and the leftists who weaponize gender, for example, who weaponize trans identities and trans people. As far as, you know, my experience goes, people, they just want to live their lives, but there are certain activists who absolutely weaponize that to undermine kind of womanhood, for example. And I think there are lots of young women who are finding that revolting and really pushing back. So whereas they're not pushing back against the whole thing, they are pushing back on the particularly egregious aspects of the ideological warfare, and they're saying no. They're really saying no. The other thing is the anti-Semitism of the left as well. Lots of people find that really sickening and push back on that too. So it's a complicated box. It's you know, it's not just kind of left and right. It's various kind of iterations of the left saying that this is just crazy and we need to think again. And some of those people will veer to the right.
Well, it's positive. It's a positive sign, like you say. If we are starting to see whereas maybe 5 years ago, it probably would have just been people like me or you talking about this issue of our culture. Now, like you say, we see the people that are naturally progressive who are happy for gay marriage, happy for legalization of drugs, happy for most things, but they see, like you say, there's certain gender being taken away from them or whatnot. So it's a very interesting complex to see how now there is starting to hit a saturation point where people are saying no, and it's younger people as well. Because like you said, obviously, it's all right having the older generation inside, but you have to win the hearts and minds of the next generation, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that, you know, I'm a 49-year-old male, so I'm a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied male. So I'm used to being at the bottom of the pile. You know, it's not a kind of. I never really think about it. You know what I mean? I go into, especially in education institutions and stuff like that. You know, you go in. It's almost like a handicap at golf. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, well, you know. But I think young women who for the first time are kind of saying, well, actually, you're down here on the hierarchy because, you know, there are many people more oppressed than you're down here, you know. I think them kind of being on the receiving end of that is kind of, you know, they don't like it, and my God, who can blame them? You know what I mean? So I don't blame them at all. It's just that I'm used to it. You know, I'm hardened to it.
So how do those on the right fight back against cancel culture? What is it? I know we said education, but right now it's only going one way, isn't it? It is only going one way. Okay, there's little wins here and there, but right now it feels like it's going one way. So, for example, during the end of last year, there was only one type of person that had their tweets marked for false information. Do you know what I mean? It's still only going one way. So,
Yeah.
what are the immediate things we can sort of do to say, or normal people can do to actually start putting their little mark down? So actually, I don't want to be censored, so to speak, because like I said, there are the people out there. We have them out there. Look at the 2019 general election. There are millions of people that are probably too afraid to speak their mind, which is probably what we need them to do.
That online space, the kind of the tech space, I think we need to be less frightened of it. Okay, and I think that that we need to support each other in a way that I'm just trying to think of this through on my feet, actually. There's something about not allowing yourself to be cancelled and surrounding yourself with like-minded people. Now, that doesn't mean kind of living in silos and echo chambers that you don't think about anything else and you don't have any other point of view. But there's got to be a point in time where we acknowledge as a society that misspeaking one word or saying one joke on social media, or liking something that maybe looking back maybe you shouldn't have liked, that can't be in a sensible society. That cannot be the end of you. That cannot be being sacked from your job. That can't be. You might have had a bad day. So I think we've got to we've actually, Douglas Murray talks about it as a mechanism of forgiveness, and I think that idea of, actually, I said this 7 years ago on Twitter. It doesn't necessarily reflect everything in my life since. Okay, it's not me. It's one tweet. Okay, so I think has got to be taken more seriously. And if we take that more seriously, in other words, if we take the emphasis off being offended and we put the emphasis back on real people who make mistakes sometimes, then I think we're in with a chance of doing that. But there's a whole other thing that comes up there, and it's about the etiquette of being online. And what happens is, when you're face to face with someone, you don't tend to abuse them, because it's just not something you do. When you look at someone in the eye, you don't do that. But when you're looking at 140 characters and you're outraged by it and you really want to wait, it's very easy to do that. So maybe there's got to be some kind of technological advancement that puts the person in there, and it's not just about words.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, Mark, thank you for joining us. I understand you've been a bit delayed in the Senate, so that's fine. I'll just give you we've just been discussing obviously the topics, and Tom, a few questions on about how we can fight back against the council culture we see online, and if big tech needs to be broken up. So I'll just put a question to you, Mark, that I put to Philip, and it's basically answering the question. Me and Philip seem to have found an answer, but I seem to have found an answer to this. But we'll ask you: is big tech a threat to free speech, and if so, how do you think it's a threat to free speech?
I'm sorry I'm late to join you. We just had our final Senate meeting of the 5th Assembly, and we were told by the chair of the Broadcasting Committee that the proper role of Welsh media was to ensure that the abolished the Assembly Party didn't win any seats at the election. So she let the cat out of the bag a bit on that, and it's a sort of tradition. I sort of worry about threats to free speech or state control, and from my perspective, I've come from a view of, well, we should have a free market, and these are individual private companies providing innovative services, and we should allow them to make their best judgments about how to run their property. And that's where I come from in terms of principle. But in answer to the question, is big tech a threat to free speech and free market voices? I fear the answer is yes. And I feel that my traditional principles, I don't have great confidence that they give me the tools for answering this question. And I'm just struck by I suppose as an economist, I looked at issues like this in terms of network effects from a sort of financial monetary perspective. And I'm not sure that works here, because you've got these great monopolies with network effects. And to take one example, we saw Parley, which I've never joined myself and hold no particular sort of thing for, but a lot of people who I did communicate with on Twitter and elsewhere were joining it. And I thought, oh, that's fine, that's competition. People engage with that if they want. And then it was shut down, at least for a period, by people saying, oh, well, they didn't have sufficient policies against hate speech and this and that. And therefore, you had all these internet service providers and others basically deplatforming this alternative platform. I also wonder if there's an analogy with some of the days of trade union power in the 1970s, that rather than necessarily always acting as profit maximizers, these big tech companies are actually pressured by the outlook of their workers, which is different in aggregate and on average than those they seek to serve in the wider society. And if you have a sort of younger, more liberal leaning, perhaps more woke focused workforce than you do people who might use your service, then there may be restraints and restrictions on freedom of speech that go beyond perhaps what's in the narrow financial interest of those networks. And those networks have enormous power. I don't pretend to a solution, but I question the applicability of some of my traditional free market principles to solving this question.
Thank you. And following on from that, we should have a question. And this question, who's it from? Sorry, Mike Daly. He goes, does there need to be a political situation in the form of a pan-national approaches to curbing these companies? Because we've seen Australia recently try and take action, and it's sort of, they didn't really go to plan how they wanted it. They just banned the news from being shown up in Australia on their news feed. So do you think this is the way forward, Mark?
I suppose I'm on the fence slightly about the Australian sort of Facebook sort of issue and whether Facebook and others should be required to pay news originators, media for content, and in which scenarios. I don't know. I mean, it seems there's an interplay of interest. I'm not sure which way I would come down in terms of that. But I worry that the networks are extending their monopolies, and the two examples I'm sort of seeing recently are saying, oh, well, you're not allowed to have cookies. I thought, oh, well, that's good, that's more privacy. But actually, it's the particular networks and firms who have got that very privileged access to customer information anyhow, so don't need cookies, who are banning third-party providers who might compete with them from using. And you see a similar position on Amazon, where previously third-party sellers had some details of their clients' customers, but now Amazon are not allowing them to have essentially any information at all about who it is they're selling to, and they're making out that's a sort of data protection enhancing privacy issue, where it's clearly in their own commercial interests to take over the value of that relationship against the third-party competitors. So they're building and extending the network effects further and further, and I do think that is a proper place for competition policy.
And I put this question to you, Philip. Do you think there needs to be a political situation in the form of a pan-national approaches to curbing these companies? Because it can't just be one country on its standalone saying, actually, we're going to take action. And then we've got, say, the rest of Europe or the rest of North America is saying, actually, it's fine, the current status quo.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, but I can't really see it happening,
No.
if I'm being honest. And I think that it needs to be, I suppose I guess it doesn't need to be top down, it needs to be bottom up. And I think that people need to stop using particular platforms and start using other ones. And it's up to kind of entrepreneurs and investors to really develop the new platforms that are rigorous, that are well served and that don't pander to extremists. I've already talked about Retalk, which I think is a really good one. I think that's a fantastic example, and I've done a Q&A on there, and Julia Hartley Brewer and Konstantin Kiszely and various other kinds of people. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that there needs to be a very definite alternative to YouTube, and where that comes from and where that's, some kind of, I don't know how that's going to happen. It's not really an answer to your national question, but if there's a very definite alternative to YouTube, then that will be very good, I think, because I think YouTube, and I know I've had experience of it. I think I've done, lots of stuff over the last few months on YouTube, and I've looked at views that have, you know, been going up, and then suddenly they just completely disappear, and something's going on there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but something's going on. So I think it's, in answer to your question, I don't necessarily think it's a top-down thing. I think it comes back to what I said before. I think it's a bottom-up thing.
Following on from what you just said there, we've seen the likes of Peter, for example, Peter Whittleshire, for example, of a conservative voice online on YouTube. We've seen his show where he's and his platforms on Twitter and YouTube where he's lost views, he's lost subscribers. We've had many different conservative content makers have videos taken down, accounts demonetized. Do you think more of these shows will be under threat going forward? Even the ones that before they were going for the Alex Jones is the first. It was, oh, we just want to get rid of Alex Jones, then the rest will be fine. Now it's, we want to get rid of Peter Whittle, and next we want to get rid of the Lib Dem talk group. I mean, where does it end?
I don't know whether it does end, and I know Peter very well. He's a very close friend, and I've been on the show several times. And I know that other kind of channels like Trigonometry and I think Darren Grimes's show, and I can't remember what it's called, and I've been on the damn thing. Reasoned. I think these. I think these channels are under threat, and I know with Peter that there was a big furore because he had Peter Hitchens on, and YouTube took the show down and then reinstated it. But that happened, and I think other things have happened, and there's just going to be more of it. And for me, in lots of ways, YouTube is the most important platform in terms of you can get an education from YouTube. Okay, you can listen to podcasts, you can listen to interviews, you can listen to people like Jordan Peterson, you can listen to Douglas, you can read their stuff, you can move on from there. You don't really need a formal education. It's all there. All you need to do is be judicious in what you choose. So I think if I had to choose a battleground, it would be YouTube, and it would be presenting an alternative to YouTube.
And Mark, put the same question to you. Do you think we'll see more and more of these things getting shut down? I'm going to have another question now, which is probably better for you to answer as well, Mark. Someone said in response to this discussion, I worry that politicians are lagging behind the general public understanding who's out there fighting for our freedoms on these different subjects. So do you think, one, that these more and more shows will come under threat in the future? And two, do you also worry that other politicians, not necessarily yourself, are lagging behind on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a constant threat, and more will come under threat. And as well as that, others who aren't taken down will self-censor. And if they are monetizing and are professionally dependent on that platform, then understandably that is going to sort of influence how they use that platform and what they say. I mean, in some ways, perhaps appropriately and sensibly, until some certainly incentivizing violence, or to my view potentially some of the most extreme content. But when you go there, it can become a slippery slope, and that's problematic. And I think we could do with sort of wider rather than narrower fields of public discourse. I think as politicians, yes, we are behind it, but also I think regulators are behind it and are slow relative to the development of technology. And before, I mean, I had a relatively laissez-faire view. I mean, I take a sort of competition economics viewpoint, a sort of antitrust sort of perspective, and there are industries where that's appropriate. But I've tended to lean to the view that in tech the speed of innovation of such, and because in the main people aren't charged for the services, I've tended to be more relaxed. But I fear the power of the network effect is so great that I'm concerned that Philip is overly optimistic in expecting competitors to come through that can nibble away at that network effect. Yes, if someone comes with a new way of doing things, a new genre, you could see that happen. But too often, those companies are then bought by the existing big players who use that further to extend their monopoly. I mean, why is YouTube, I believe, owned by Google? Why is that something that was thought appropriate for a competition perspective. And if you were looking, one thing I do that there may be network effects, there may be monopolies, and it may be to the consumer benefit to allow that rather than to stop them. But to allow those monopolies to extend into a new adjacent sphere, or to stop competition by buying up of anyone who might have a better product that could compete with them, these are huge threats, and I don't believe we've got a solution to them. And I'm concerned that, well, perhaps he's not optimistic, but I'm just not sure how likely it is that they're going to be constrained by the mechanisms Philip says, although I wish these competing things well. But I fear for many a founder, the amount of money they can be paid by the existing incumbents is such that it's understandable they sell out.
So you're not.
Yeah, sorry, Mark. I said that I suppose in the context of what I've been saying before, and I said before, the first thing I said, look, there are no easy solutions to this, and it's going to take a very long time. So I think when I talk about kind of bottom up, I'm talking long term. I'm not really talking short term.
Mark, what would be your suggestions, and how Philip's mentioned before how it comes to education, a major focus on education. Mark, how would you say is the best way to sort of battle against these people who want to shut down free speech, want to censor? How do we fight back against this?
Well, I mean, the example I give, I don't believe that Google should have been allowed to buy YouTube, but also I guess that's primarily the US sort of antitrust authorities have called that, and there didn't seem to be any serious consideration, I recall, given to blocking that that merger. I mean, the advertising and the revenue streams and spreading those, but I think it's. I mean, I'm not sort of the idea that government comes in and sets the parameters of free speech. I don't find terribly attractive. Either. I'm concerned that without a Bill of Rights and without the commitment in the Constitution similar to freedom of speech, we're less well placed perhaps for dealing with this than some in the US are. But the idea that, I'm struck by how quickly this has moved. I remember when I was on the Home Affairs Committee in the House of Commons, and we had some of the tech companies in, and we were looking about what they did in terms of dealing with extremist content. And I think our last Facebook was probably 2012 or so, and they were regulated by a regulator in Ireland that had a sort of tiny staff, and I'd just done some research into how limited that was and questioned the counsel for Facebook about it, and it looked fairly preposterous that they were claiming that was a sufficient degree of regulation. And Twitter at the time didn't even have a sort of a counsel or sort of public affairs person who could come and speak to us. Things have moved on since then at such an odd rate. But the idea that sort of Nick Clegg is somehow chairing some committee that's going to decide who can say what on Facebook, I mean, I query whether that could be a solution. I don't know what the answer is. I'm sorry, but I try and engage with the subject and apply my principles, and I have a great degree of frustration that they don't give me answers.
Following on from this, we've had another one from a question from someone, Connor, he goes, how can national bodies like the Competition and Markets Authority deal with these emerging monopolies then? Does there need to be international conferences like there are for climate change? How do these bodies, with what we've already got, these national bodies, how do they deal with it? Because we have got, like you said, the national bodies like Competition and Markets Authority. Can these deal with it? Do they have sufficient teeth to deal with it or not?
And I think one area where we do potentially have scope to improve is in tax. And one thing that asserts government control and influence is the degree to which they pay tax. And I feel that it's within the European Union, our inability to clamp down on tax evasion in terms of whether it's Switzerland, Holland, Ireland, or a combination sort of them, and to tax on the basis of revenue in our jurisdiction. We now do have powers to do that in a way we were constrained by EU law from doing before. But I think for how we deal in terms of the competition law aspects, I think that we do have some role there, and I'm open as to whether it's to work more closely with the US or with the European Union Commission regulators in Brussels. But I think if we do join in a joint approach, it's much more likely to be influential, and I think it's unrealistic to expect for a global approach. But if we can join either the EU or the US regulators and look for support from Canada, Japan, sort of Australia, a coalition of the willing, if you like, then I think you could put something together, something sufficiently powerful and coordinated, or sufficiently common view that you can actually influence what these companies do through a common approach. It's not easy, but I think it can be done at that level, if not at a global level, which I don't think is realistic.
Do you have anything to add to that, Philip?
No, I agree, and I don't think there is a huge amount to add to that. Really, it's certainly not as far as I could with my expertise being in another area.
Well, I've got a question for both you, from Chris Wood. He goes, if we believe in small government, who should decide what constitutes hate speech and who should police it? Is it down to service providers such as tech companies? Is it through legislation? Or should we take the approach that free speech is free and is in its entirety, no censorship? I'll start with you, Philip.
Well, we've got hate speech laws, haven't we? So that's the complication there. It doesn't matter who says what, where, or when. It's the hate speech laws, which I can't remember when they were brought in. Were they brought in under Mark might know this? They were brought in under the Blair government, I think, and they're bad legislation, I think, and they were done very quickly. So the idea of hate speech, I think hate speech can mean anything at any time, especially when it's coupled with ludicrous kind of concepts like lived experience, for example. So you've just asked me a question, and actually I'm offended by that. I think there was a tone in your voice there that constitutes hate speech. So it's absurd. It's an absolute minefield. And the more you think about this, I was kind of thinking about incitement laws and libel and all the rest of it, which are very clear and old and good and useful. And yes, we live in a complex society, and it is a fractured society, and we do need to think about these things in complex ways. But the hate speech laws, I think, are a real barrier to us, and until we get rid of them, I don't really know what the answer to that is.
And I'll put the same question to you, Mark. I'll repeat it. If we believe in small government, who should decide what constitutes hate speech, and who should police it? Is it down to service providers such as tech companies? Is it through legislation, or should we take the approach that free speech is free in its entirety with no censorship?
I think the hate speech phrase and umbrella is not a helpful one, and it means different things. There's different things within it, and people, I don't think, have a common understanding of what we mean when we say laws on hate speech. The traditional key law is that it's a criminal offence to incite violence. That's clearly correct, and there's a line that people shouldn't cross and will face the criminal law if they do in general. The Blair reforms, as I understood them, at least initially, was that when a crime was judged by a court to be motivated by a particular protected characteristic, and that you'd attack someone because of their race, then that could be an aggravating factor in sentencing. And I'm sort of more ambiguous, perhaps, in my view towards that. What I think is greatest concern, but also where my understanding is hazier, but I'm fairly convinced that there's confusion elsewhere as well, is what constitutes sort of hate speech outside those two categories. And there seems to be an awful lot of recording of non-crime incidents by police in respect of hate speech. So where we're talking about it being criminalized, but actually in many, if not most of these circumstances, is not. It's something else entirely. And I'm not sure if it's a sensible thing for police to be spending their time on attempting to regulate what people say on Twitter in that sort of way. I think a lot of the answer can be, and I'm not saying this is excellent, there are difficulties and unforeseen consequences, but anonymity, I think, makes it a lot worse. And I always try and connect myself with what I say online. I try not to do stuff anonymously. I mean, what I actually object most to is just the use of swear words and aggression and nastiness too easily. I mean, particularly as elected politician. And you shouldn't incite violence, and it can be aggravating if you commit a crime that is protected characteristic motivated. But we need a serious overhaul around what's called hate speech. What they've done in Scotland, I think, is quite wrong. I can understand slightly where the Law Commission is coming from, as well, let's make this all sort of more coherent and clear. But when they poke into private homes more in consequence of that, again, I think that's wrong. And I think we should, we've got too much stuff that's in the non-crime area, and I think we should push back against the degree of regulation by the criminal and other law in this area, which I think has gone too far and is not good for society and freedom.
I completely agree.
I think. Sorry, just to add to that, the throwing identity politics in the mix there, and protected characteristics are subdivided and subdivided and subdivided and subdivided again. That becomes really problematic. And to use one of their expressions, and it all feeds on itself. It all feeds on itself, and that's the real problem. It comes back to this idea of the identitarian, I think, and I've mentioned that word so many times tonight. But it is that it's identity politics, and it's playing identity politics, and play. Outside of incitement and nastiness and all the things that Mark talked about there's also playing the game of being offended as well.
But to both of you, mention identity politics, do you think the UK government is indulging in identity politics at the moment? And do you think it's playing a dangerous game if it is indulging in identity politics?
Mark, do you want to go first as a politician?
I mean, broadly, no. I mean, I think it's quite reasonable for a minister to give an interview with his sort of national flag behind him. I just find that sort of unobjectionable, and I just can't understand or really grasp how many people there are in our country disproportionately on the left who feel there's something questionable about that. But I think what there is, to a degree, and I think the government has gained from this, I don't know how much it's playing identity politics, but it's certainly aware of this cleavage and looks to benefit from it, is a profusion of groups defined by a particular identity and an increasing dominance of our politics by that leads to pushback from those who don't feel they're in those sort of categories. And the sort of tendency in the US for the Republicans, particularly under Trump, to become a disproportionately male and disproportionately white organization is in part a response to identity politics amongst the Democrats. And I think in this country, the UK government and the Conservative Party is a lot more careful about not crossing lines that would appeal to people specifically on the basis of them being white or male. But I think their support has become somewhat more like that, if not as extreme as we've seen in the US. And if you define yourself and your politics by identity, then don't be surprised if people who don't share that sort of push back in the other direction. It's not a sensible way of doing politics, because politics is designed to make choices that we have to make and to compromise between interests. And if everything's defined by identity that can't be changed, then politics doesn't work and we get stuck as a society.
Philip, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at the cabinet and I think it's healthy and in lots of ways doing a great job, and people are there because they're I'm thinking about what Priti Patel has been saying over the last few days, and they're just doing a great job, So I think the government are kind of are doing that quite well. It's not that kind of self-conscious nonsense that the Labour Party would, which in itself you could argue is really racist and all the rest of it. I think they could be firmer in areas like education. I mean, they're doing reasonably kind of well, but there could be more done there. you know, I started when we first started talking, Edward, didn't we? And I came back to the idea of education, and that we need to kind of rescue the institutions and education generally from the leftists and the identitarians, and I think they could be much firmer in the way they push that, because as I said at the beginning of this webinar, that changing people's mindset and actually educating them out of this really reductive, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual, this A, B, C, D, E, F, and this is how I was born and I'll never change, you know, all of that kind of thing. If we can move away from that, then that will impact on our behavior on social media.
Brilliant. I completely agree. Like you say, it has to come from a change with the education on that front. But we've got time for probably one last question now. So it's a question I say to the end. So it goes: if big tech censorship is another symptom of the culture war, how do we win the war? Is it winnable, and where do we go from here?
God.
I thought I'd leave the best question until last. I really did. I thought I'd leave the best question until last. So yeah, is this another symptom? If this is another symptom of the culture war, how do you win this war? And where do people go from here if they want to sort of fight back, so to speak, form a counterculture to it?
The honest answer to that is I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Because I can't look into the future. If you would have said to me, you know, at the December 2019, I stayed up all night for the general election, and if you would have said to me, right, you know, a few days after that, right, what's going to be the agenda for the next year? Right, it's going to be kind of, you know, a fairly radical conservative, whole nation, but radical conservative reform and Brexit, okay, and then COVID happened. So who knows what's going to happen? I can't look into the future. I can look to the past, okay, and I can say, well, as kind of conservative, we're not that good at the culture wars. We've got better lately. And that's because you know, that's because of big tech in a way. That's because of, you know, of the last few years, YouTube and all the rest of it, as I said before. So I just come back to the fact that it's going to be really slow, and we've got to fight on all fronts, and it's going to be a war of attrition, and it's going to be a drag, and that's probably about as far as I'll go.
Thank you. And Mark, if big tech speech censorship is another symptom of the culture war, where do we go from here?
I mean, do we want to win the culture war, or do we want there not to be a culture war? I mean, I live in politics that isn't defined by identity, and looking at this in the context as a politician in Wales. I mean, I initially came to politics because I wanted the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. That was what motivated me. We achieved that objective. In a Welsh context, broadly, I support free market ideas, but our politics is, I think, increasingly, and when I abolished the Assembly Party, I think it's played a role in this, defined by that sort of nationalist cleavage. What do we think about devolution? Do we want more or less of it? Should we get rid of it? Should we have independence? And when politics is defined primarily, I think, on that cleavage, there is less space for the traditional left-right sort of socioeconomic issues. I think what Philip said about just the makeup of the government, what it's doing at a UK level, I think, you know, one of the best things about it is just the profusion of senior ethnic minority voices and many very impressive women in good roles, means that the gender and race cleavage is less important for that government, and people from an ethnic minority or women are not defined by that, because they're within the Conservative Party and it's not into identity politics in the way the left is, but also just the quality and quantity of individuals is now such that it's changed the mood, and people on the centre right are no longer shy in this debate in the way they were before, and they have a valid centre-right conservative or more liberal libertarian leaning perspective, which the left find far harder to deal with when it is presented in the voices from people of identities that they like to think they own on their side of the fence. So that's a lot of breaking it down.
Yeah, it is. I think we've got time for, unfortunately. We have just done dead on an hour. So I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and especially to Philip and Mark for tonight. It's been a really thoroughly enjoyable discussion. I really enjoyed picking both your brains tonight. Unfortunately, Mark, we only got 40 minutes, but I really enjoyed it nonetheless. And Philip, thank you both, and thank you for everyone for tuning in.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
Well
Bye-bye.
done, Seth, for Wales.
Cheers. Bye.